All right, I'm recording and I'm with Mendi. Mendi, thanks for doing this with me.
You know, thank
Um,
you.
Talk to me a little bit about where you are in your author journey.
Okay, so I have done several trunk novels that are going to stay in the trunk, and this series is the first one that I am saying, yes, this is the one I'm going to publish. Um,
Nice.
and it is an urban fantasy, and
Okay.
I've written book one. I am holding off until I finish at least a big part of the series
Yeah.
before publishing.
Okay.
Um, and that's so I'm on book two now.
Nice. Are you planning to like rapid release style where you like drop one and then,
Yes.
a couple weeks later? Nice.
Yeah.
That's great. That's exciting. I am pumped for you for
Yeah.
that. That'll be great.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so you sent me a dialogue centric first draft, which to explain for people listening, what that means is you write to make sure the piece is primarily dialogue and like focuses on the character interactions as opposed to focusing on descriptions or as opposed to being like driven by summaries of like how the character's feeling. You write the interactions first. So that's like vocalizations and body language back and forth between the characters. It looks a little like a weird screenplay without the screenplay formatting. And then you come back and add stuff. You add like exposition on on in strategic locations and like build it that way. How does talk to me a little bit about how it feels to work this way?
It
Do you like
I
it? Do you hate it? What's
I actually love it a lot.
nice?
First drafting is painful for me. I
Hmm.
don't see the scene. I don't hear the characters. It's very
Okay.
much feel it through. So focusing on just one thing at a time keeps me moving forward. I
Okay.
love revision. That is where I feel much more comfortable in everything. And I have a engineering brain. So I prefer to work in layers.
Nice.
And if I don't do that, I will not have any emotions in the scene at all.
Gotcha.
Emotions is my hardest thing.
Okay.
And so if I don't remind myself to add emotion in for mood changes or what she should be feeling or how she should be
Yeah.
reacting, and if I put that in as instructions, when it comes to then the final writing, it's very, very quick because all the pieces have been put into perspective. In the
Okay.
past, I have tried similar to the skeleton drafting or the fast drafting.
Hmm.
But what would happen is I would get out the scene, but then still forget everything because that's just not how my brain personally works. So I work more in puzzles. And so this
Hmm.
dialogue first layering approach is very helpful for me.
That's fantastic. That makes me really happy. I started writing this way too when I first started. I've talked about this before on the podcast, but I started with just writing a short story every night for a year. I kind of caught the fiction bug and was just like cranking them out. And for me, it's the opposite. I see everything in the characters interacting. And so I didn't understand why I would need anything else. I was like, I just need them talking to each other. What else do I need?
Right.
So I had a lot of short stories when I first wrote that were like just dialogue. And I took them all and I forced them into a weird little book that nobody should read or buy called Seven Nights at a Bar. But yeah, there's like five of the short stories that were like just dialogue. I was like, I'm just gonna put them in here. So anyway, that's I love that this is helpful. And I love
Yeah.
that it's good, that it's working well for you. So you had asked me like when you sent it, you were like, okay, I'm specifically struggling with Jamal's voice.
Mhm.
These are four character scenes and they're super complicated.
You
And so as we look at them, I just want to give everybody an overview real quick of what's going on. You've got your vehicle character, your POV character Rook,
Yes.
um, who's kind of a no nonsense, little snarky, right? Like how
You're,
else would you
how else would you write an urban fantasy
yeah,
main character?
yeah, the classic urban fantasy main character. Rook is having side conversations with Azrael. Is Azrael a
Yeah.
demon? Yeah,
A dragon spirit.
a dragon spirit. Okay. Sorry, I just couldn't remember what I read.
No, it's okay. Yeah,
Um,
no.
is having side conversations with Azrael. Only Rook can hear Azrael.
Yes.
You've got those written in like the fancy brackets,
Yeah.
which is by the way, done really well. I was impressed. I was like, dang, you're holding it together. This is great. And then you have a dragon that's nonverbal, like a little dragon that's
Like a
nonverbal,
pet,
like a
your
pet.
typical
Yeah.
dog, except that
Yeah.
it's a pet dragon, of
And
course.
that's Spitfire.
Yes.
But you're doing a great job of keeping Spitfire engaged in the conversation, like just even though they don't talk. And I
Right.
want to look at that because you're using Spitfire's body language to have them as a participant in what's going on, which is awesome. And then you've got a fourth character named Jamal, and Jamal is thoughtful, slower, more mentory-ish. Is that true?
No, I would put him. I mean, he is her ground. He is her foster brother for
Mm.
centuries, and
Okay.
so he is his grounding force.
Okay.
Think of his like where Azrael is going to be the mentor. The hey, you got a plan. Stop running headlong into everything. Jamal's kind of like, hey, that's who she is. I'm not going to change her. I'm not
Gotcha.
going to change at all. Don't make me change.
Okay.
And so he's been used to letting her run.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, no, I wrote him four different ways.
Okay.
And I find because I just couldn't have, I was trying to making him a little bit more melancholy, artistic,
Hmm.
but I was having so much trouble writing that. I ended up doing a little bit more the analytical, thoughtful, where not suspicious, where like if I use Enneagram, so
Yeah, yeah,
Azrael's more like the prepper and
yeah,
everything's a target,
yeah,
everything's fearful. He's more like logic, but the artistic soul.
yeah. And you're getting Azrael's worry. You're nailing it. Like as a six, I feel Azrael's pain. Um, but yeah, so we want to talk about Jamal's voice. You
Yes.
also had a question of like, how do I keep all of the characters engaged? Like, how am I
Yeah.
doing in large
Yeah.
person conversations? Um,
Because
anything else?
what scares me is this is going to be the norm going forward. And I'm a little scared that I took
Oof.
off more than I
Whew,
could, but yeah.
it's a lot. It's
Yeah.
good. You're
And
doing
so
great. But yeah, it's a
I'm
lot.
gonna have to like, split them off at times. But at the same time, in general, I'm gonna be having four characters, and I don't want this to get exhausting for an entire book, much less an entire series,
Okay.
because Azrael is always going to be with her. So
Yeah.
at the minimum, it's a two-person scene when she's technically
Yep.
alone. And
I love
then,
that.
but most of the time it's going to be she's with at least one other person. And, Spitfire is always going to be kind of, there's always the pet thing.
Yeah.
So there's a chance that, later in the story, there's going to be five people. I'm like, ah.
Yeah.
And so
So,
I stepped away. I wrote an epic fantasy, speaking of trunk novels, and this is why I stopped it,
okay.
because I hit a whole cast scene and I realized I was going to have to keep this up for the rest of the book, and I was not there yet.
Yeah, it's a
So,
lot.
and so now I'm here with
Okay.
this one.
Okay. So let's talk about I want to talk with you about making sure that all the characters are involved.
Yeah.
I want to, and we want to, and let's talk a little bit about the difference between on a reader, that big cast scene where you've got like three or more characters versus the one-on-one and
Hmm.
how to balance those um to keep you sane as a
Yeah.
writer. And
Yeah.
then let's also talk about making sure all the characters get engaged. Um I also want to talk to you about color coding because you color coded it, which I loved. I'm just curious how that worked for you. Um, anything else you want to cover while we talk through stuff?
The last part was just more the tactic of like, okay, I figured out the scene. I figured out, oh, because yes, I do constantly forget
Mm,
Azrael, and I constantly forget the Spitfire, and that's where I add it back in. But then I'm kind of like, I need a way to go forward for how to go from the script to making sure I get everything in.
gotcha.
And
Okay. So like how do you take this dialogue centric thing to like the next stage?
right, well, in terms of the levels, like
Yeah, yeah.
where do I put the feelings? Where do I put
Yep.
the
Okay.
descriptions?
Okay. Do you want to go big to small or small to big?
Don't care.
Okay.
Dealer's choice.
let's first talk about the color coding. I'm going to
Yeah.
share the screen. Um,
Dun 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 dun.
yeah. This is great. So this is something that Laura, the other dialogue doctor coach, and I
Yeah.
often recommend of like, hey, if you want to see your character voices, color code them. And you did that. Like
Yeah.
Spitfire's purple, you've
Right.
got Rook is red, Jamal is blue, Azrael's green.
Yep.
I've added these segment breaks in.
Hmm.
Yours was straight through. Um, how did this work for you?
It was excellent because I quickly realized a lot of times I had dropped Azrael or I had dropped Spitfire.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
was like, oh, oh, there's too much this color. So that made it very helpful.
Okay.
Um, right now, though, it's way too colorful.
It's a lot. Right now, it's like, whoa, there's a rainbow happening on the page. And it's
Yeah.
great. I
But
love
now
that you,
yeah.
yeah. And it's how it was super helpful for me because I actually just went through and looked at Jamal's voice. I was like, let's just
Uh-huh.
look at what Jamal's saying.
Yes. Oh, yeah, I
Um,
did that too. I did that too.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you just pick them out, which is nice. Some things I love that you're doing with this technique, because it's rare that I actually get somebody who did it and I can like show what they did. You're also color coding their body language. Oh, so smart, so great. Because that a lot of times we just color code their vocalization, like what they say out loud, but like the body language is their participation in the conversation. So that like putting that body language in the color code still allows you to see like, okay, I'm grabbing this character may not be speaking, but I'm grabbing them in their participation in the conversation. Does that make sense?
Yep. 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 That
Yeah,
was the point.
I think a lot of times we confuse dialogue to be like, oh, it's what people say out loud, but dialogue is the interaction between the characters. So you nailed it.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk about let's go big to small.
Okay.
So when we're talking about like where do I put the emotions? Where do I put the descriptions? Where now that I have like the characters interacting, what do I do next? Um, you kind of have three different, and when we're looking at like the book as a whole of like, man, these scenes that are going to be the majority of your book that are these like big cast scenes where you've got these four characters interacting, maybe a fifth and a sixth thrown in there at times.
Yeah.
Those are great because they build a lot of energy. They move, right? Like the character interaction makes the reader feel present in the scene and builds energy with the reader. So they're moving through the pages quickly, they're moving through the scene quickly. At the same time, they are slow to move. You accomplish less per segment or per beat, which I'll talk about in a second. But like we'll get into segments in a second. But because everybody participates. So it's like, man, this is like we're like like this feels like pages. So there's a deceptive energy that's given to the reader because everybody's interacting. It's fun. All the characters are there. Um, everybody's feeding off of each other. There's that energy that builds. But then at the same time, you can't write a whole book this way because you're gonna have like 24 hours is like 100,000 pages. So
Right.
those big cast scenes, though, I want you to keep that in your mind. Like these create energy. And then when we talk about the one-on-one scenes, and you have one here where it's just Rook and Azrael
Hmm.
for a minute, a beat where it's just the two of them in a room alone. This is where intimacy is built, specifically intimacy with the perspective character. So in a one-on-one scene, and we're talking big level, there's small level to build intimacy too, but big level to build intimacy, big cast scenes build energy and excitement for the reader. One-on-one scenes build intimacy with the perspective character for the reader, and it pulls us into that perspective moment with the reader so that the reader starts to feel like I am very close to this character, right? There's less
Hmm.
distraction, there's less energy. Now, the third type of scene you have that is missing completely from a dialogue centric script is the third type of beat is that descriptive beat where you're going to have exposition, where you're going to be like, they walked into the house and it looked like this, and they looked around and this was going on, like those paragraph forms. Sometimes those paragraph forms are going to be like giving the reader a like build into the scene, right? Like
Hmm.
Rook had never felt like like she had, it's she, right?
Yeah.
Rook had never, sorry, I had to remember. Rook
Yep.
had never felt like she had been this place before, and that, made her remember this time with her mom, and like that, like
Hmm.
reflective background where the character is, you're describing how the character's feeling, but you're also kind of in the character's perspective, especially in this first person POV where you're like, or third person close, where you're like building into the character there. So that is a different type of connection with the reader. It's not intimacy with the character. It zooms the reader out and gives the reader this larger perspective of the narrative. And it's a little heavier. It makes things feel slower, but it also gives the reader a moment to kind of breathe in the narrative. You get away from the energy of character interaction, and you get a moment to kind of sit back and like reflect on everything that's happened in the story, right? So you've
Makes
got
sense.
these three types of moments. You've got big cast scenes, and on the podcast I've talked about chorus scenes before, where you're like
Mm.
grouping characters together. They're just another form of big cast scenes. You've got like big cast scenes, one-on-one scenes, and these like reflective moments of exposition. So you as a writer can use those strategically, right? You want conflict, action, moments where characters need to live out the change that they're making in your big cast scenes. So that's when you're going to move. You want world building in your big cast scenes,
Mm.
right? Like
Yeah.
anything that's like, okay, this is something I have to accomplish as a writer, put that in your big cast scenes because you're going to get that energy going. Does that
Right.
make
Right.
sense?
Yeah.
You want to use your one-on-one scenes for moments in which the character is reflecting on choices they might make, on who they are and who they're deciding to be. So when it comes time for Rook to think like, okay, is this the right decision we're making? Is this the right thing? Pull that into a conversation with Azrael, and you get a like more intimate, personal look into Rook's character change.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep.
And
Yeah. Because
then
he's going to be the uh, he's definitely the engine to get her to accept her limitations.
nice. Yeah. And so you want those moments where she's thinking about her limitations, processing her limitations, feeling the pain of defeat because of her limitations, because she's
Right.
given in to her limitations. You want that in one-on-one scenes with
Hmm.
Azrael. You don't want that in a big cast scene because it's not intimate enough. And
Mm.
so like you're gonna get, a lot of people engaged in that discussion of how Rook should change. You want to pull that down to just Rook and
Yeah.
Azrael.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those expositional paragraphs are larger narratives, like exposition scenes. We want to make sure they come in between segments, and they're likely like in between segments of big cast versus one-on-one. You don't want to interrupt a big cast or a one-on-one with those, which
Uh,
is why the first thing I did was I broke your segments, which we'll talk about in a minute. Like I added
okay.
in here, like, hey, here's where segment 2 starts, here's where segment 1 starts. Like, so
Hmm.
we'll pull into that in a second, but you don't want to, you want to get those narrative descriptions, summaries, large reflective moments in between segments because they weight things down. After a one-on-one, you're going to have more because you're intimate, and then you reflect on that intimacy.
Okay.
After a big cast scene, you'll have some to transition into the intimacy, but you don't need a lot. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you'll want them in between each segment, but you want them smaller in between big cast and one-on-ones. You want bigger ones between one-on-ones before you move to another big cast, because you want to let the reader come back and like take a step back and be like, whoo, man, what just happened? We had this big action with the big cast scene. I got a little breather. You gave me like a little bit of break in like a little narrative paragraph describing the scene transition, and then you took me to this one-on-one, and things got real
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
minute.
Uh-huh.
And the things got real between those two characters, and now I need to take a step back and reflect on that before we move into the next big cast scene, or we move into the next one-on-one scene if we're building intimacy before action. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you
One
get
of the
kind of, oh yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead, sorry.
Well, one of the concerns I have is the overall scene is still moving forward fairly fast. in
Hmm.
terms of urgency.
Yeah.
And so stopping to have paragraphs gets, I was really struggling with that.
Yeah, so you're feeling it, right? You're like, oh,
Yeah.
I like this big cast energy that's happening. I like the urgency that it creates. If I throw these descriptions in here, all of a sudden we're like, oh, like we deflate.
Yeah.
So yeah, you want to hold them, right? And that's the
Right.
thing, is that there's no right or wrong way to do this. You've got these three tools, and you know what
Mm,
the tools accomplish. So you can manipulate your reader's experience by using these tools in specific ways.
I like that. I like
Yeah.
that. Okay.
Okay, so let's look at segments. So the first thing I do when I after I've like, and a lot of times I will just raw draft a scene like this. I'll just like throw things, like I'll just throw crap on the page. And
Right.
I get kind of what you had, which was this just like raw back and forth dialogue. Every once in a while I'm like, okay, I need to do something here.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Like
That's
I
exactly what
gotta,
that is.
yeah, I
Yeah.
gotta do something. But then I'm just getting back into it. Like, okay, the setting changes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what's nice about how you're writing these is you're already getting the segment breaks. And by a segment, we have an emotional moment of character interaction, or a beat in which like we're in one place. If we change location, we change topic of the conversation, we change members in the conversation, or we change emotional tone in a major way, we're moving into another segment.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So
Hmm.
the first thing I do when I have a dialogue centric script like this, well, the first thing is I take the colors out so I can see it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then,
Exactly.
yeah, after I take the colors out, I because I've analyzed, I've like looked at voices and all that
Uh-huh.
in
Uh-huh.
my dialogue centric draft. But for writing purposes, the next thing I do when I'm done with the dialogue centric draft, I'm ready to move on, is I make sure I have segment breaks. Now I won't write them in here like I did for you, but what I'll do is
Other
I'll just
people.
space. I'll just put like
Uh-huh.
4 spaces so that I can visually see like, okay, I
Mm,
need something here. In your segment breaks is where you want to make sure coming into a segment that the reader knows, well, there's things the reader wants to know. The reader wants to know, where are they?
mhm,
What do my surroundings look like? The reader wants to know, who's in the room with me, right? Like,
mhm.
who's here? Like, did somebody leave, or are we all still in this place?
Right.
The reader wants to know, what's the general emotional tone
Mhm,
going on in this room? And then the reader generally wants to know the conflict.
mhm.
What is being unpacked in this moment of the segment? Does that make sense?
Yep. Yep.
So you don't have to give the reader all 4 of those things. Giving the reader all 4 of those things makes the reader feel very grounded going into the beat. Withholding some of those things makes the reader feel a little unsteady. Sometimes that unsteadiness is really nice, because just like, the old myth about like, well, a blind person hears better, which is
Yeah.
dumb.
Yeah.
But it's always the superhero thing, like Daredevil can't see, so he can like
Yeah.
sense things, especially his other senses are more active.
Right.
Um,
Right.
that is true though here in writing, where like if you withhold who's in the room, the reader will pay real close attention to where they are, and they'll pay
Hmm.
real close attention to like the emotional tone, especially if you emphasize one of those things over the other. So this is just cheap tricks that I'm teaching now, but like, so if you want to start a scene, especially your first segment in a scene, if we think of a scene as like, this is a continuous movement and part of the story, and then we think of a segment as like the beats of that scene or the breaks in that scene. If you want to start a scene with just voices, you don't tell them who's there, you don't tell them where they are, it's just people talking. It forces the reader to really focus in on the emotional tone, right?
Right.
If you start off with like 3 paragraphs, which I always like, Stephen King
Yeah.
is the guy that I was like, if I need an example of this, I just pull up a Stephen King novel. You want to start with like 3 paragraphs of like describing where things are happening.
Right.
It grounds the reader in like, okay, this location is important, I know where I am, this is a clear place to be. Does that make sense?
Hmm. Hmm.
But like if you're Kafka, you're just going to talk about who's in the room.
Right.
It's me and the interrogator, and we're off to the races. It was like, wait, where are we? Kafka's like,
Right.
it doesn't matter, right? Like, so there's that, like, branch out of like making us unsteady specific ways. That's just that you really have that power at the opening of a segment, at the opening of a scene, because once you open a scene, now we kind of know where we are in the segments, and people will transition from place to place, but we're going to assume the characters that were in the last segment are in this segment, unless you
Right.
tell me they leave, right? Like,
Hmm.
so you only have that power at the opening of the scene. Okay, so we break it into segments, and what I'm looking for is I'm reading through your dialogue. I'm like, okay, where do things end? Now, yours are great because you're writing in these action beats, and then you have a narrative POV. You are like clearly like, oh, I've already marked the
Oh,
segment, right? Like,
okay, okay, okay. I see
you
where you're going.
super easy for me. Setting change, new segment, right? Like action
Yeah.
beat, start of a segment. This is like start of segment 4, end of segment 3. You had narrative POV, Rook dismayed that she can't
Hmm.
grip the sticks like she used to. Action beat, Rook takes her sticks, grips the sticks. So here you have this like we're in the same setting, we have the same people, but there is an emotional change here. There's an
Hmm.
emotional tone shift. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to break it into segment 4, and I'm just going to digest it differently.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, there's no right or wrong way to do this. And this is kind of a like, it is a segment 4 because I said it was segment 4,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
I get it. I get it.
But what I'm doing is I'm thinking about where do I need those narrative paragraphs? So I
Right.
can start making that decision of like, where am I adding exposition, right? Like, so you have another action beat here,
Hmm.
starting segment 5. They're moving through this space together. End of segment 5, start of segment 6, because you've got an action beat where the dragon sprite, right, like catches a stick. Brennan's so proud, and then we have a topic change where
Ah,
Jamal says, "How well are you?" Right, like
yeah.
they're in action here around fighting, and then Jamal looks at Rook and is like, "How well are you truly?" There's you feel the emotional
Hmm.
downshift of
Yep.
like
Yep.
gah, 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 right, like we're shifting down emotionally. So I'm going to give like a little mini segment here where there's like a beat of emotion, and
Okay. So
then
they can be pretty small then.
they can be very small. And again, this is up to you, because what you're looking for is like, where do I need to pause and give the reader just a breath, right? If you think of your big cast scenes of like, I don't know if you're a swimmer, but I was a swimmer as a kid, and you used to sprint when you swim in a race, right? Like, how far can I go without taking a breath? Because when I put my head up to take a breath, I lose a millisecond of speed. So how far can I just streamline? And then I need to take a breath like every third stroke, every fourth stroke. But if I try to do the whole race, especially if it's like a long one, without taking a breath, I'm going to pass out. So I gotta breathe. So what you're doing when you're building these segments is you're like, where am I letting them catch a breath?
Okay.
And so
That's a
that's
good.
why,
I
like,
like that. I like that.
I want to get a small one in here because we have this moment of intimacy between Jamal, Azrael, and Rook, right? Like they're
Hmm.
pulling aside for a minute. They're like pulling in for a moment. Jamal's asking a personal question. There's a change in emotion. I want to give Rook a minute to reflect on what just happened before I move back into the like setting change. Does that make
Mm.
sense?
She's not a reflective person.
And that's okay. We can talk about
Okay.
her voice and how that happens in a
Okay.
minute.
Okay.
It's less about when I say letting her give a moment to reflect, it's less about her like voice and more about the structure of the prose on the page.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
What you're really doing is giving the reader a minute to breathe. You're
Hmm.
giving the reader a minute to go, okay. And you're giving the reader a minute to like gather what just happened.
Yeah.
Right.
She just lied.
Yeah. And her reflection can totally be here, like, uh, you know, this third person or first person?
First person.
First person. That's also what's nice about a dialogue for Cedric first draft.
You can
You don't
change.
have to decide yet. Yeah. So first person, she can be like, I totally lied to him, but I don't care.
Yeah.
Setting change, right? Like
Yeah.
that's all you need, just like a pull out of the moment and then like coming back in. Um, so then we have a longer segment here in segment 7, because it's again, big cast segments are going to take more time because everybody's talking. So we got more engagement. Uh, I'm breaking it here because you have a setting change
Hmm.
again.
Hmm.
So we got another segment, right? And then I'm breaking it here because we have another setting change. They're moving into another room that you can just start to imagine like, oh, I need a paragraph here giving them the where are we?
Where are we? Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Where are
And
we?
that was kind of the idea. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't need a who because we're all together. but
Mm-hmm.
I am going to need a where. And up here, you'll have like a note to yourself where you're like, emotional change mood goes grim, somber,
Mm-hmm.
and grim. You'll need to give me a small, at least a couple sentences or a small paragraph on like, why is the mood changing
Right.
from Rook's perspective? Um, yeah. So where, and then setting change, another
Mm-hmm.
segment starts, right? I think 10 is the last one. Was 9 the last one? Nine's
A
the long
10.
one.
Yeah.
Because we have a big interaction here at the end. And this is, and I could have broken a segment here in the action beat, but the tone felt the same to me. The
Mm-hmm.
movement felt the same. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to keep it because
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to lose that energy by adding paragraphs of exposition in here. So I want to keep that energy going. I'm going to make this a really long segment. Readers, hold your breath. We're getting through this. Like we're gonna sprint
Right.
for a minute.
Right.
But then here in 10, you're slowing down a bit. You've got another segment change.
Right.
Oh, I
Oh,
wrote it wrong. I messed up my
oh,
numbering. I'm sorry.
yeah, there we go. That's okay.
Yeah, shh, don't tell anybody. Nobody can see this. Um,
Just
and then
just between us.
just between you and me. And then
Right.
segment
And then that's the end.
11, you're gonna have a smaller one. Now, if you want to go really deep into this, you'll start to discover your author voice by how you pace these segments.
Mm,
So, and
okay.
this is a weird thing, but once you start seeing and identifying segments, you'll be like, yeah, it's my natural tendency to escalate to the end of a chapter with like a really big segment and then to drop a small one at the end. Right. Like that's one way you can do it. What I tend to do is I tend to start with huge segments. Like this is just my author voice. This is how I write. I start with a big cast scene. Everybody's going at it. It's getting big. And then I come down to a one-on-one and then I have a reflective paragraph. And that's how I tend to like, that's how my scenes tend to work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know why. It's just how my brain visualizes the scene. It's part of my author voice. But you'll start to find that you have patterns. The really nice thing about like looking at your writings, strategically like this is once you recognize the pattern, you can start screwing with them. Because if you've got
Yeah.
like 4 patterns in a row, change the pattern, it's going to throw off how the reader feels about the chapter. Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
Okay. Any questions about segments and why I'm
Nope.
breaking?
I like that.
Okay. And just to recap, what I want to do is I'm identifying these segments and then I'm going to be like, okay, here's where a paragraph of exposition goes. And you can stop and be like, what do I need?
Mm-hmm.
Do I need the who, where, emotional tone, and conflict of perspective? Do I need Rook saying here like, as I moved into the next room, I wasn't sure
Mm-hmm.
what we'd find there. Do I need to restate the conflict for the reader? Maybe not. Maybe the last conflict still carries over. Do I need to like reset the room? Right, like I moved into the
Mm-hmm.
guest room. There was a bed in the middle of both of them, and like the window shown in, creating a such and such atmosphere of such
Right.
and such place. Right, like because you're not just describing things to describe them, you're describing things to help add to the perspective that Rook has of the room. Like what does Rook notice is important,
Right.
and why does Rook notice it? And then like moving from like is everybody moving together? Because you have one scene where we go to 2 people. We need that moment that's up early where we just go
Mm-hmm.
to Rook and Azrael. You have a note here like, hey, get rid of people, right? Like Jamal leaves, Spitfire leaves, right?
Right.
Rook is
Yeah.
exasperated. So here you have you've noted for yourself an emotional tone. You probably need a paragraph or at
Mm-hmm.
least a couple sentences that's like, as they stepped into the other room,
Right.
I took a deep sigh. I couldn't believe that like this was
Right.
happening, and how often, why do I keep bringing Spitfire on these missions? He's the worst. He's running from room to room. I wish he'd just slow down. Can't we just pause and take it easy? And then stop searching uh
Right.
the
Right.
back,
Yeah.
right? Like then Azrael can come in and speak. So
Right.
yeah, so that's what you're doing with these segment breaks is you're finding them so then you can come and like strategically add in paragraphs of like, here's where I know I need those 4 elements and I'm
Right.
going to give the reader a break. How big or how small a break am I going to give the reader? Do I want to like let them pull all the way out and spend like 5 paragraphs in this moment of room description and breathing, knowing that like I'm losing my energy,
Right.
but I'm giving them time to reflect? Again, it's part of your author voice. I usually don't do those until we get to the end of a chapter or like the end
Right.
of a scene. My scenes end up just being chapters, which is terrible.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Not how you're supposed to
Yeah.
do it, but that's how I do it. This is bad. Um, because I'm a short story writer at heart, so each scene is like its own little short story, and I'm like, oh, we
Right.
finished the chapter. It's the worst. I'm terrible. So at least I know my foibles though. So
Right.
you're gonna get that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, because the I have a sense of where the scene breaks as far as setting changes go, and take the time to reflect and see where they're at, ground them for. It's that emotional reflection beat
Yeah.
that I don't know where to put.
And that's what you need to be asking yourself. And it's
Right.
part of Rook's voice is when you get to the break of a segment, be like, is the emotional tone for Rook changing? If the emotional tone for Rook is changing, put it here. If
Okay.
Rook is in the same emotional state, you don't need an emotional reflective beat. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because they're going to carry the emotion over from the last segment. Until you
Right.
tell them it's changed or modulate Rook's voice in a major way, they're going to carry that emotion. They're going to assume the emotion from the last segment. So
Mm-hmm.
if you're changing emotion, like if at the end of a segment, Rook is feeling differently than Rook felt at the beginning of the segment, then you know at the segment break, you need to give the reader a like, hey,
A
here's the
hint.
emotional
Yeah.
transition, right? Like
Right.
this
Right.
is what just happened. Rook just you probably noticed Rook was crying. Here's Rook reflecting on the fact that they're crying, right? Like, or
Right.
that she's
Yeah.
crying.
Yeah.
So, what a lot of authors do, they really want to get across, and this is what this kind of dialogue centric writing helps you avoid. What a lot of authors do is they really want to get across emotional change. They're like, no, 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 emotions are changing, emotions are changing. So they start interrupting their segments with a couple
Yeah.
sentences
Yeah.
of like
Yeah.
emotional change. What that does, though, is it sucks the energy out of your segment and it pulls the reader out of the character interaction. So, if at all possible, you can keep those emotional reflective moments, lean on your voice modulation, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Rook's cadence, like the syntax of his words or her words, the words Rook is using, the the topics Rook is talking about, the body language Rook has, that kind of stuff is modulating through the segment. Trust yourself that when you say Rook puts her hands in her pockets, we refer that to like, oh, there's some kind of, shame or like avoidance going on here. Like we trust your reader to know what that body language is. And then at the end of the segment, give me how Rook is feeling. Don't force it into the middle because you don't trust your voice modulation. Does
Okay.
that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
Because
got what,
that's
yeah.
where the problem is when you got a big cast scene,
Yeah.
is if you stop to talk about her reactions,
Hmm.
it just starts getting to be this muddy mess,
And what you're doing when you stop to talk about her reactions in a big cast scene is you are ending a segment and then restarting a segment
whether
in a
you want to
place
or
you didn't
not.
want to. So when
Right.
you end that segment, now I need those questions. Where am I? Who's here? Emotional talk. Did they carry over from the last segment? Great. But what you've told me is take a breath in the middle of this. And
Yeah.
so all of that
Okay.
energy, all of that urgency, all of that like engagement that was happening in that big cast scene, when you force me to take that breath in the middle of that scene, of that beat, I lose all of that, and then you have to restart it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And like I said, there's times when you intentionally want to lose it. Like this
Mm-hmm.
beat here between this nice like opening segment where they're looking through a room and we're seeing them all interact and everything's good, and then here we move into Azrael and Rook having a
Mm-hmm.
one-on-one. I want a narrative moment here,
Mm-hmm.
like an expositional moment where you're telling me Rook's reflection on, Jamal and Spitfire and feeling exasperated at her brother. I want
Right.
that here. Ideally, you've shown that a
Mm-hmm.
little bit in Rook's body language and in vocalization that Rook's giving, but then I want that in here. And then as I want that break here in the segment to reflect like, yeah, Rook is exasperated here. She
Right.
doesn't
Right.
like
And
this.
these breaks could be anything from a two-sentence paragraph to five paragraphs,
So five
depending on.
paragraphs. Yeah, I tell
Right.
writers don't go over eight
Yeah.
paragraphs. If you
Yeah.
go over eight, especially it's
And
tricky.
yeah.
It's because I can say like don't go over eight paragraphs, but then recently I just finished James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, and his
Yeah, you had
first
said.
like, oh man, yeah,
Yeah.
his first like 25 pages are just, expositional paragraphs, but they're amazing. And
Yeah.
like they keep and he's using tricks in those to make them feel like big cast scenes. That's another topic for another time.
Right,
But
right.
I modern readers want the big cast scene because that's what we get in television and visual media,
Hmm.
right? Like visual media is just one big cast to one-on-one scene
Yeah,
all the
yeah.
way through the end. You don't get narrative breaks. So these narrative expositional breaks are actually to our advantage if we use them strategically, and you want to give like your reader similar but different. Hey, this feels like a movie in that I've got these big cast scenes, I've got all this character interaction. You feel like you're present in the thing, but I'm adding on to it by I'm giving you these moments of reflection. But we don't want to destroy what the reader likes in the like character interaction. Yeah. Okay, I've talked that to death. Anything else we need to talk about?
No, that gives me a lot to work with.
Okay, let's talk about Jamal's voice. So
Yes.
there are times where, and toward the end of the scene, Jamal sounds more like you want Jamal to sound like. At
Uh-huh.
the beginning of the scene, Jamal sounds like Rook. So I
Uh-huh.
can
And that's
see you coming into Jamal. I'm like, oh,
yeah,
we're pulling into it. Does that make
yeah.
sense?
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, that's definitely the problem.
Okay. I don't know that there's a fix for that problem
Uh, that's fine.
before in drafting.
Okay.
Right, like so the steps that I would take if this is how I was right, if I were in your shoes writing this, is I would do this first draft before I go find segments. I just look at Jamal's voice and I'd be like, where does it sound like Jamal and where does it not?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to look and I'm going to do it one segment at a time. Jamal looks at the bungalow, American Sign Language, in case somebody's in the house. Plan? That's fine because he's using the sign language,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Now, you skip into a narrative section without answering Jamal. This is the other thing I'm looking for in segments is the conversation full? Is the conversation complete? So, action beat, uh, Rook winces at the talons digging through her leather jacket. Azrael, stop allowing the dragon sprite to hurt you. How else? Rook, I told you already, just need sleep. Azrael huffs. Jamal looks at the sky and the bungalow's sign language. Plan. Now, I want to add here, let's search the back. Now we're going to have a narrative paragraph. And the reason, and you had let's search the back after your narrative paragraph. I want this up here because it's part of this segment.
Okay, so I was taking that in terms of almost real time in the sense that she's processing what the plan is,
Yeah, let her go ahead and say like, let's search the back and then show me that processing. You're
as
right.
opposed to the
You're pulling it out of real time, but we're keeping the energy together because otherwise the reader reads this, let's search the back as part of segment two.
okay,
And you want to keep it in segment one and be like, I didn't know what else to do, right? Like we got to search, like give me a little bit of like talking back on the decision she just made
okay.
in that paragraph, but that'll keep the energy of the segment together before you move into the next segment. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
we want to give a like all of your segments are going to have a cadence to them where you can feel like a conductor being like, okay, bring it down.
Right.
Here's the narrative exposition. Now bring it back up, right? Like you as the writer being that conductor.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so here's a moment where I was like, is this Jamal? Show Jamal not acknowledging, instead turns and sprints to the back. Now you've described Jamal as like reflective and thoughtful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does the reflective and thoughtful dude sprint?
No, right. Yeah. It was
Maybe
more
if
the
he's being
desperation.
chased.
It
Yeah.
will, yeah, no, he's desperate. The sun's
Yeah.
coming.
Yeah. And so, have him hurry, have him
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
walk. But
Okay.
this is one of those places where like his body language is his voice. So like,
Oops.
does he sprint?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I get it. I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's look at segment three, because here's another place where like I wanted more back and forth. And the part of the problem you're having with Jamal's voice is he's not talking enough. at least in
Okay.
this scene. His
Uh-huh.
voice is kind of absent because he's not speaking. So I want to get him engaged more in these scenes. Sorry, coughing into the mic is never great.
Yeah.
I want to get him engaged more in these scenes so that his voice is a little bit stronger. So action beat started scene segment 3, setting change. You're going to have a paragraph explaining to me to where we are, right? Maybe a
Mm-hmm.
paragraph if the tone hasn't carried over from Azrael and Rook, which it probably hasn't. Again,
Right.
like give me a note of urgency and a little bit of the like, here's the conflict that we're dealing with. Spitfire flies to the porch. Proud, he beat them in the race, sniffs the opening grass. Oops, sorry. That's great. That's Spitfire's like participation. Jamal pulls the dragon spider away. Jamal tilts his head and raises an eyebrow to Rook. Nice in the voice, right? Reflective and
Right.
thoughtful. Rook breathes out and lies. I was inspecting the backyard first. I was inspecting the backyard first. Rook lies. Mood change. Jamal's curiosity or pain, give
Right.
him a little body language where he's like looking at her. Right now, you had Rook cutting him off before he could say anything. But I'm going to go ahead and let Rook say Lydia's not much for landscaping, with the intent of cutting Jamal off before he said anything. But then I'm going to have let Jamal speak. And you said like sometimes he speaks in like little poetic
Yep.
rhymes or
Yep.
whatever.
Yep.
Give him something dumb to say, right?
Yep.
Like that doesn't necessarily change the mood because we're not changing the mood till the next segment when Jamal comes right out down here and says like, how are you sure you're feeling okay?
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
we're not doing that till later. So up here, give Jamal something like that.
E-
Lydia's not much for landscaping, right? Like the
Right.
one who doesn't keep their,
Yeah. Yeah.
those who
He's
can't.
concerned is because she should have beat him and she didn't.
Yeah. And but what's happened here in your emotional flow is that Rook is like, I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah. Exactly. And
So
she
instead
doesn't.
of keeping Jamal silent, I'm going to let Jamal follow Rook's lead
Okay.
and say something about
Okay.
the backyard, right?
Yeah.
Like, and then let Azrael comment.
Like, yeah.
And then let Rook be like, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
right? Like, yeah, yeah.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And then,
I, I
yeah,
was
does that, am I,
concerned. Yeah, no, this is good because part of the problem I was like, oh, well, if I keep him quiet but still show, then I don't have a big cat. Like I can
yeah,
manage the big
it's not
cat
a big
scene.
cast scene anymore. So let Jamal follow Rook's lead here and participate. And that way, when Jamal comes back and actually doesn't follow Rook's lead, it feels more impactful.
Okay.
And you
Yeah.
get Jamal's voice playing in a little bit, and you get to like
Hmm.
throw in some weird little poetry thing that
Right.
Jamal
Yeah.
can say about backyards that doesn't matter, right? Like it's not
Right.
adding content; it's just something stupid.
Right.
So here we
Okay.
move into segment 4. Rook snarls, not a word, lug nut, because Azrael starts to speak, and then Rook winks at Jamal with fake vibrato and says, "Ready to dance?" And you had, "Are you certain?" Right? Give
Hmm.
Jamal more words, right? Like just to distinguish Jamal's voice from Rook. Ready to
Okay.
dance? Are you certain? Sound the same number of words,
Oh
same
yeah. Yeah.
cadence, right? My card's empty, leaving me completely available for a round on the floor.
Hmm. Hmm.
Gives Jamal, and that may not be the right phrase, but
I
something
know what you mean. Yeah.
longer.
Yep. Yep.
Change Jamal's cadence so that he feels different.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to do it here too, always and forever, right? Rook speaks in these like half sentences.
Hmm.
Go team, Ortherkin. Now that's
Otherkin.
for the
Otherkin.
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 That makes more sense than what I said.
That. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That though is a direct motto of between them.
Yeah. So you may not change that.
Yeah.
But I was like, I do want more words here.
Okay.
Right? Does
So
that make
add
sense? Like,
add to it. Add to it. Add
yeah,
to it.
just build it out. Right? Like
Yeah.
give
Yeah.
Jamal some moments. You'll start to like Jamal's voice better.
Okay.
Spitfire's missing from
Oh yeah.
this.
Once again.
Sorry.
Yep.
So just
No.
give Spitfire something to do. Right?
Hmm.
Like doesn't need to
Hmm.
add content, doesn't need to be important. Right? I
Right.
have chirp, growl, whatever
Yep.
Spitfire
Yep.
does.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So here in segment 5, this is where I'm like, okay, we're starting to connect Jamal's voice. Permit her to escape, whippersnapper. She possesses more domicile rights to the abode than we do. Can you
Yeah.
feel the difference
Oh,
between
that
that?
and that is his. I was like, because I that is his true voice.
Yeah. Can you feel the difference between
Yeah.
that and
Mm-hmm.
are you certain?
Mm-hmm.
Or Jamal sprinting, right? Like there's a different feel to that.
Yeah.
This was where I was like, okay, now we're catching up.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're getting so when you're looking at your segments before you start like writing in, and especially when there's a voice you're not catching, just take a beat and be like, okay, where did I catch it and where did I not catch it? And how do I make Jamal sound like that later? Does
Or
that
the
make
whole thing.
sense?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's where the color coding really helps.
Yeah. And here's one more place where like I want you this is a weird thing because Azrael and Rook are talking to each other and not to Jamal and Spitfire.
Mm-hmm.
If you start, this is a weird note that probably will apply to no other instances, but my gut is if you start a segment with Rook, Jamal, and Spitfire, you have to end the segment with Rook, Jamal, and Spitfire. If you start with Rook and
Mm-hmm.
Azrael, you should end with Rook and Azrael. So this segment starts with Rook and Jamal. Azrael then pulls Rook's attention away.
Mm-hmm.
Give me another Jamal and Rook because it's about time. It's about like
Yeah.
where are we in the moment? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
These Azrael and Rook conversations almost feel like they're happening outside of time.
Right.
And so ground me back into time by just
Mm-hmm.
giving me one more interaction between Jamal and Rook. And you can cheat if like you want this narrative beat here to be small, the expositional beat between segment 5 and 6, have them restate the why. Have them restate the like cause that they're after here, the conflict that this scene is driving in. You're not adding more content. You're just saving yourself from having to do it here. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Or because if I see two, like 5 and 6 are pretty small,
Mm-hmm.
maybe move the action beats around.
Mm-hmm. And make them all one, right? Like
Right.
you could give this, or you could just not be like this actually isn't a segment break. Like be like, I'm
Oh.
not breaking a segment here. And then just let Spitfire move. And then here's your interaction between Jamal and Rook that I'm looking for here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's where this becomes flexible and about like, hey, there isn't a right way to do this. It's about pacing the reader's experience.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Again, here, like, so Rook says, or maybe she was forced, and then they move into the next setting change. I might give Jamal like a response here of like Rook saying maybe she's forced. On the other hand, that kind of hangs in the air.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that like decision about like, do I want that hanging in the air or do I want Jamal to respond? If Jamal responds, is it just physical, perhaps a
Mm-hmm.
thoughtful gaze and a frown, or do you let him vocally say like, yeah, right? Like, or like
Right.
that would make this more tragic, right? Like something
Uh-huh.
that like some kind of vocalization that expresses his emotion in this moment. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and part of that also is his voice. Like, how often is he silent in a big cast conversation? Right now, he's pretty. I'm saying get him speaking more because
Right.
he's missing. But in this moment, you might be like, no, Jamal's not going to talk at this moment because that's
And
how
make
his
that,
character
but make
is.
that intentional.
Yeah, make that part of his character voice.
Right.
But it's
Eh,
about the decision you're making here.
Yeah, and that's the hard part because he doesn't talk much. I mean, he is very much a quiet, but he's with Rook,
Yeah,
and that's his safe space. So
yeah,
um he does his modulation. You're not seeing it here as, but I was keeping him quiet mostly because I was trying to not have a big cassine.
yeah, yeah. But you need to. You need to have
Right.
this
Yeah.
action. We're
Yeah.
moving,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like,
Right. Right.
yeah. Um, this I don't want this to feel overwhelming or too much because I'm gonna be like, here's 72 steps to finishing this scene.
No.
Um, the more you do it, the easier it'll get, the less steps you'll have to do. Because you
Right.
won't have to once you start really clicking in Jamal's voice, you won't have to go back and write it again. Right? Like you'll get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah. Uh I would let so here's another this is just a stupid dialogue trick. Jamal sues the dragon spirit. I estimate a couple months old. Jamal points to a boarded up window with the dangerous cracks and allows the spry sunlight to froze. Illogical to call this place parafolk safe house and not account for vampires. You can see how we've got two beats here for
Mm-hmm.
Jamal.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead and let somebody speak in between. Like it's just a cheap way to get another voice in here to keep that big cast energy going. When somebody's doing two things, just go ahead and break it and like let somebody else get in there because it builds that energy a little bit more. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
This was great. Like I felt like toward the end I had less and less notes. This was an interesting, like, this is the first time Rook has acknowledged, let me speak to Azrael. Usually it's just happening.
Yeah.
Is there a reason it's different here?
Well, just because again, it was going to be for the story perspective.
Gotcha. Okay.
Asriel needs to give a whole big explanation.
Okay.
As you can see, I kind of
Yeah,
broke it
yeah.
up, but it's going to be that here's the narrative, here's the info dump.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so at the same time, I didn't want to have this ping pong going with Rook trying to talk to Jamal at the same time she's trying to talk to Azrael. That it was
Gotcha. When you finish
so
these,
I was trying
yeah.
to like as like I did before with somebody else's sort of like, hey, shush, be quiet. I need
Yeah.
a
Yeah, that's perfect. That makes perfect sense. When you finish them, make sure you always have a note here of like, hey, this is what Azrael just said, or like Rook conveyed Azrael's thoughts to Jamal, and because we need to come in and out of this moment. Does that make sense?
mm-hmm.
You do it here
Yeah.
great. But yeah. Um, again, Jamal speaks here, and then you have Azrael and Rook talking, but Jamal isn't talking to Azrael.
No, right.
So give me Spitfire or Rook here. Does that make sense? Otherwise, this Jamal just stands alone. Spitfire lands on Jamal and tries to read the note curious. Jamal saves the note from the sprite's talons.
Mm-hmm.
Pharaoh lands indeed. The same Cabal who constructed those skin grimoires we found over the boulder. Azrael and Rook now talk. Azrael talks. That's appalling. So in real time,
It,
this is
it,
what's happened.
yeah, yeah. It's and that's again where you see some of the troubles I was having because it was sort of
Yeah.
like, hey, I recognize that silence was long, and so now he's getting even more worried that, oh my gosh, you're not answering
Yeah.
me. It must be really, really bad.
And I might, instead of like pulling, I mean, that's a good, I actually
But
like what you're saying there. I might not change it, but
but that's the struggle.
it's the struggle. Yeah. And this is one of those moments like the one that we noted up top where it's like, hey, Jamal's doing two things.
Yeah.
Maybe just give somebody else something to do. But if you want the silence to hang intentionally, like you're saying, then you're right. Just leave it how it is. Does that make
But
sense?
I could have like Rook put up her finger to say, wait a minute, shush,
Yeah. Give me a
or something,
second.
or something. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Or you could like you might have this go on and then you might have Spitfire like, Spitfire cocked his head.
Right,
I
yeah.
don't know how cognizant
Right.
Spitfire is of silence, but like
Very, very, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
Spitfire cocked his head at Rook and grunted like what's wrong with you?
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
As if to say, what's your problem? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but again, putting him in segments I think will help with that.
Yeah. You have this in an action beat. I just want to make sure don't summarize that. Jamal murders a curse and spirits and sprints out the back door. Don't
Oh, really? Okay.
don't summarize that. I don't know that I need to see the curse. I don't need to hear the curse, but I need to be present in the moment.
Oh,
Does that
okay.
make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Um yeah, this is all great. I don't really think I had
Mm-hmm.
any more notes for you. Is there anything else you want to talk about with it?
Let me think through the I think that was the main stuff. So essentially, once I get the segments to work, I think that's what I was missing because that's how I can then, in terms of the layers, where do I put those layers is kind of
Yeah.
my, and now that that helps, it should be very easy to take that right to prose.
Yeah, and that next layer for you is that like, okay, I'm going to put in my segment breaks. And then the last, I actually write, and there's two ways to do it. You can write the exposition as you come in and put in dialogue tags. I tend to do that now, but when I was first doing this, I would actually do the exposition and then make a note, then to come back and do dialogue tags next, right? Like,
Okay.
and create two separate steps. Now I just kind of do it all in one, but
Yeah.
I used to do it in two. It's really about what you're comfortable with
Yeah.
and how it
Okay.
feels. Yeah.
Well, good. Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, this was great. let me, and I love, thanks for sending this to me. It was
Yeah.
fantastic.
Oh, good.
Let me stop the recording. We can talk a little bit more.